Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Karan Wadhera. Karan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Erik. Thanks for having me.
So Karan, you're the managing partner of Casa Verde Capital. Why don't you get into what is Casa Verde Capital and what's the story behind it?
Yeah, so Casa Verde is a venture fund that is exclusively focused on the cannabis industry. We have a thesis that cannabis is going to be and is one of the most exciting sort of investment themes of our generation. And we are fully focused on investing in businesses in and around the industry. We closed our first fund in January 2018 and have been incredibly active ever since. We've invested in over 20 companies, between ourselves and our vehicles. We put, well over $150 million to work with co-investors and have looked at all sorts of really dynamic opportunities in the cannabis industry. We're probably most well known for some of the ancillary opportunities, what's known as sort of non-plant touching businesses that support the ecosystem, but aren't necessarily involved in cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, or retail. But now we are a little more broad in our spectrum and can sort of invest in anything in and around the space.
I want to get into a sort of market map of the space today and how you think about the different sort of subsectors within it. But before that, why don't you trace the evolution a little bit of how the space has evolved? Like, what was it like to invest in the space a decade ago, or was it even, when did it sort of start? How would you sort of characterize like the different waves or phases of this industry?
Yeah, no, and we've thought about that a lot because I think the space has gone through a lot of transition and development over the past couple decades. So I'd say, everything pre-2000, let's even call it pre-2014, was in this kind of vague realm of medical cannabis. And in some states that was very clear. In other states, it was very much open to interpretation. So for example, California, where I'm sitting for most of the past couple decades was a medical state, but it was not very difficult to get a medical card to be able to purchase cannabis, and therefore it was kind of open season. We would get on you could get on a Zoom or a conference call like this and get your prescription that quickly, and then you'd be on your way to any one of many dispensaries, and you could purchase all sorts of products. So that was sort of the first phase of investing. It was very much under the radar. Not a lot of taxes was paid. Pricing was all over the place, heavily a cash business. And then, as we saw Colorado come online in the U.S. as the first fully rec state, I think that would become the first phase of maybe what you would call sort of 2.0 in the industry, which is, and the big difference being there was now a very heavy regulatory compliance layer on the industry. And you had to sort of, really follow the rules quite strictly if you wanted to survive and pay taxes and sort of, be subject to now all this new regulation. And then I would say there's another phase of all of that that's really been in the last, call it, 2 or 3 years when there's been a real shift in maturity. And that came with, not only California coming online as a fully recreational state, but, another 9 states, Canada going fully legal from a federal perspective, the first G7 nation to do so. And then now this has very much become a pretty compelling global story. So, you can look at it in those sort of waves. And the way I would distinguish between them is that first wave, really had no institutional capital. It was very much, either bootstrapping or, some family and friends putting money into entities which were, again, let's just call it in some sort of gray zone of legality. In that second phase, you saw a little more institutionalization, certainly with, people putting together more sort of formal organizations, seeing legalization ahead and the path of what cannabis is. And then today, when you have bankers involved, full-scale public companies listed in Canada, some companies listed here in the US, global opportunities, institutional funds like ours playing a heavy role in the space, but also more traditional venture funds as well, investing in and around cannabis. So yeah, I've never actually done that before in any formal way, but as I sort of spell it out, I would think about it in those kind of three distinct phases. And with each of them has just come more and more sophistication.
Totally. Now, how would you sort of make a market map of where you like to consider investments at either sort of cannabis proper and then sort of adjacent spaces? Why don't you sort of think, just sort of walk us through a little bit, what are the potential sort of subsectors?
Yeah. So basically for us in sort of our investable universe and where we put a lot of attention, we like to simplify it in saying that we want to invest in, great scalable businesses that are being run by fantastic entrepreneurs. And, initially, as I mentioned earlier, that focus was a lot on technology and services and ancillary businesses that support the industry at large, because we felt those were the least capital intensive and had the most ability to scale and touch the larger industry. So I think that's where we put a lot of our attention. And there's a number of companies, and maybe I'll just give you a few examples to give you a taste and flavor of the kind of things that we invested in there. We were early investors into a business called Greenbits, which is one of the leading point of sales in the industry. So you could think about it like a Square at your local coffee shop. Dispensaries have their own point of sales, particularly because of the reporting that needs to be done from a compliance perspective back into the state government. We're early investors in a business called Dutchie. Dutchie is one of the leading sort of e-commerce players in cannabis. It really enables those same dispensaries to launch delivery and pickup. Dutchie has proved to be an invaluable service during COVID. They saw, their gross merchandise value on their platform go from a few $100 million annualized to $2.3 billion annualized in just a few months. And that prompted a Series B that just got completed, which Howard Schultz and Thrive Capital just led. And then, we also see other unique areas like financial services, right? Given cannabis has this, federally illegal status, but then has, different legalities from a state by state level here in the US, there's a huge gap in the sort of traditional services that a cannabis business can access versus a more traditional business. So what we're starting to see is, businesses being built to help bridge that gap and start to create layers that don't exist. So Bespoke, offers short-term financing, inventory financing, invoice factoring, these kind of services to dispensaries and any cannabis business actually, who need working capital to sort of fuel the lifeblood, obviously, of their operation. So it's all these kind of interesting businesses that can help the industry in some fashion, either, automate some reporting, be helpful from a working capital financial perspective, or, really push commerce forward. And we've invested in 20 plus companies, so there's a lot of those as well. And then, what we consider, plant touching, we definitely have a huge interest in what will become the important critical brands in the future, consumer-facing brands, right? So, if you think about it like your Coca-Cola, Budweiser's, or Marlboro's, these are brands that have been built over decades and have developed a lot of consumer trust and have just become staples in many ways. Cannabis doesn't really have that yet, just because we're in such early parts of maturity. So, we see that as a huge growth opportunity. It's going to come with a lot of struggles and ups and downs, but it's something that we have a huge amount of faith in, and it's something that we're starting to spend more time on as well. Our latest investment is a little bit of an offshoot of that. We led a $9.5 million round into a business called Proper, which is a holistic sleep solution business in which CBD will be one component of the formulation. And that is a really good example of how we're starting to shift our thinking about the space at large. Because, in the past, that may not have seemed like an investment that would have been, up our alley. But, we see cannabis in some formats as, just another ingredient that, sort of helps a larger solution to, the many issues it can tackle. And sleep being one of the most prevalent reasons that there is cannabis use among consumers. and CBD being, more readily available and nationally distributed. So we're super excited. It's a deal we did in partnership with a group called Redesign Health, which has been behind a lot of really exciting direct-to-consumer healthcare businesses. And so, probably give you a little more information than you asked for, but we want to invest in great businesses that can scale. Ancillary makes a lot of sense to us, and then brands obviously have a lot of those same qualities that we really appreciate.
How have you thought about the delivery space? So companies like Ease or Meadow, or how have you sort of viewed that sector? Do you have any bets in there? Or where do you think is going to be make a winner there?
Yeah, we were early investors in Ease, and then Dutchy, which I mentioned to you. It's a little bit different, but also sort of enables retailers to have delivery and e-commerce themselves. I think it's a no-brainer that this will continue to be a very important part of the cannabis ecosystem, and that has nothing to do with cannabis, right? Meaning, delivery is just now how we interact from a commerce perspective in general, whether it's our groceries or our dinner, and cannabis is no different. We're definitely big proponents there. We think it's going to be very important, and we think there's going to be probably multiple winners and multiple players, like you've seen in other spaces like food or even in alcohol delivery and things like that. So we're bullish on that space and think there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. What are sort of the big questions in the space about how the space will evolve? I imagine a lot of them are regulatory. But what do you think are sort of the big forks in the road within the industry and that will affect how the industry evolves?
Yeah, I think that's a big one, right? Because the regulatory shift enables a lot of additional services and resources to come to cannabis in many, many facets, right? And a lot of those are investable, and a lot of those are, medical, and some of those are just social justice, right? And kind of doing what's right. So I think what you'll see is a number of regulatory changes that will come in the course of the next few years in waves. So the exact order of how all that unfolds is unclear. And if I knew, I would be able to predict lots of other things. But I think, what certainly you can see is, decriminalization at a federal level is certainly imminent. There's a vote on that actually this month in the House. It's unlikely to pass the Senate or go any further, but it is, the right sentiment and kind of shows where the temperature is in the country. I think the most necessary change in the interim will be rescheduling cannabis. Cannabis is still a Schedule I narcotic, which puts it in the same breath as heroin, which is just absurd. So the minute that changes, cannabis can have a different status. You can get federal funding for research. We may even then see some sort of banking services open up. There's a couple of specific acts which are in front of Congress, which I think will also come to fruition in years ahead. One of the ones that people are very excited about is something known as safe banking, which would allow the federal banking infrastructure to be part of the cannabis industry in states where there is a legal infrastructure. So I think you'll start to see all these things play out over time. And I think the question just becomes on timing. So regulatory is definitely probably one of the biggest, but one of the other things that happens when you start to see those things shift is you'll see more money come into the space, right? So, we've been early in that journey as, one of the early kind of institutional type funds focusing on the space. But with that, we've worked and helped to bring in a lot more of that more traditional capital into the space, right? And done deals with Tiger Global and Thrive and, even conglomerates like Imperial Tobacco. We think that the shifts in regulation also start bringing in a lot more capital. And, that means more institutionalization. That means more professionalism, sophistication. And you just start to see sort of, cannabis continue up that curve.
And within cannabis, how much of it is sort of concentrated among of people who are actually supplying the stuff? How much is concentrated among sort of major players versus this long tail? Like, is there a Shopify for, what is sort of the breakdown?
Yeah, it depends where you're looking. So like in certain areas, there's a lot more concentration. So for example, we're investors in LeafLink. They're by far the dominant kind of wholesale online marketplace, for folks like Dutchy and e-commerce, Greenbits and point of sale. On the ancillary side, I think there has been some growth and dominance there and building market share. In the more traditional sectors like cultivation, manufacturing, retail, no, there's no real dominance. You may see it on a state-by-state basis, especially in what we call limited license markets, where the government has actually, by definition, limited the number of licenses there. And there may be a few players who have a good bulk of them or own a good chunk of that state. But on a national or global level, there's no one who has any significant market share at all. There's a massive long tail.
Yeah. Well, when we look back at, you probably mentioned some of them already, but when we look back at the last 6 years, 8 to 10 years at the companies that have sort of really defined the space, that sort of showed opening in certain subsectors or just sort of changed the game, like the equivalent in e-commerce would be, Amazon and Shopify and a couple others. What are the companies that come to mind here?
Without being biased and talking about the names we've invested in, right? Like, but one of our largest investments in a company that's just so central to cannabis in the US is a business called Metric. And Metric is the compliance platform that the states actually use to monitor and track the cannabis industry. So, their clients are the state of California, Colorado, Massachusetts, Nevada, Oregon, the majority of sort of large recreational states. And so that has been really critical because, again, it's helped in sort of the graduation of cannabis from an illegal black market business into a more regulated industry. So I think Metric is certainly one of them. On the larger scale, I'd say some of the pioneers in Canada, even though they've had a lot of issues and there's been ups and downs in their stock prices and things like that, were hugely influential, right? When Canada legalized cannabis at the federal level, it did allow that kind of inflection point that I was mentioning in your last question of more institutional capital to come into the industries, create a public capital markets, right? So you had companies like Canopy and Kronos attract investment in the billions of dollars from the likes of Constellation Brands and Altria. That's pretty unique and pretty differentiated and allowed for some, really compelling changes. And I think that started a wave of even U.S. companies being able to list through reverse takeover in, secondary markets in Canada, like the Canadian Stock Exchange. And I think all of that was hugely influential in starting to create a more liquid asset class for something that had been, fairly private. So while I'm not necessarily a complete proponent of that, and, I think the best opportunities are by far in the private markets versus some of these public opportunities, it definitely was a big momentous change when those things started happening in cannabis.
Yeah. I'm curious where you see the white space going forward in terms of, do you have a request for startups in terms of, if you were giving this talk in front of 100 entrepreneurs who wanted to do something in the cannabis space and they're sort of trying to pick the right idea or the right subsector or the right sort of problem to go tackle, where might you encourage them to go look?
Yeah, we think there's still a ton of opportunities. We're sitting on lots of really compelling data among a lot of great businesses. I don't think there's necessarily yet been, a complete winner on that end of what we can do in business we can create. There are definitely some great companies out there that exist, but I still think there's a lot of room for growth. Compliance continues to be, a huge issue and bottleneck for a lot of businesses. So people who can help, simplify that for folks in the industry, I think is still a huge opportunity. We're very interested in the sort of financial technologies that can be, with financial services and financial technologies for cannabis, we have this really interesting opportunity, which I think people sometimes forget. It's not about just saying, bridge this gap, and then once we have full-scale legalization, all these other players will come in and do your job. I don't think that's how it's going to work. I mean, I think my view is, because we're starting from scratch in many instances, we can actually create better platforms. In many ways, cannabis is way more tech forward than any other industry because we've only really been building in the last, call it, decade in certain ways. So we've had the ability to utilize technology in a way that industries that have been around longer, it's more disruptive, right? To include a new compliance system or bring forward a new point of sale or have all these we're built on all this regulation, so we almost have to be more tech forward just to survive. So I think in that way, I think what we can do now and the services we can build, even from a financial perspective, will remain and probably be like very attractive acquisition targets in the future as well. So I'm big on the fintech space as well, and we're doing a ton of work there. But yeah, those are the few areas that we think are really interesting. And then, as I mentioned before, consumer facing brands, none of these dominant players exist yet. And there's a good chance that, what will eventually become, one of the leaders in some of the subcategories for cannabis don't even exist. So, we still see a ton of white space in that area as well.
Is there yet a sort of Yelp for all the distributors out there, or sort of a rating system for?
Kind of. There's a few. So LeafLink, which is a wholesale marketplace, that's where they have pretty significant market share in the states where they're active, and so retailers would go on there and be able to look at all the various brands that are there. There are some recommendation businesses like Leafly, also a very similar name, which does some of that. And there are others that have been launching as well. So yeah, there are some of those that are there. I think to your point, that is the one intimidating part about the industry, right? Especially for non-consumers, is okay, cannabis is really interesting. It's legal now. Maybe there's a product for me. What is that product? And what does it look like? And do I smoke it? Do I eat it? Do I drink it? Is it a tincture? Is it a topical? There's a lot of unknowns. So yeah, education is a big part of it. Right now, the main source of kind of that recommendation engine is what we call the bud tenders, right? The actual clerk in these dispensaries. They hold a fair amount of power because you go in there and ask them something, they're going to tell you, and unless which you probably don't, you're going to listen to their recommendation. But I think, like we see in any industry, over time, the consumer will have a lot more of that power. They'll take a lot of that education and discovery into their own hands. And there will be resources outside of just that retail environment which can assist them.
Are you bullish on CBD, or are there big businesses that are sort of leveraging that or creating products around that?
I think like everything, there are phases. So yes, I have a big belief in CBD's ability to be really effective for various conditions. I don't think it's this cure-all you just throw into anything and here's my soda with CBD, here's my cookie with CBD, and CBD is in everything and just makes it better. I don't necessarily believe that. I also think you need a pretty significant amount of CBD per serving to really get its impact sometimes. At least I do for sure. So I think that's it will be, I believe, an important ingredient. And as I mentioned to you in our latest investment in Proper, we didn't even launch with a CBD SKU. It's coming and it's in the roadmap. And we think it can be very effective from a sleep perspective, often in combination with other clinically proven ingredients as well. So we're bullish on it. I think CBD is here to stay. I don't think it's something that is a fad, but I do think, just throwing it in everything is not the right way to go. And I do think it loses some of its efficacy if it's in a bunch of random products.
Totally. How should we think about sort of the cultural conversation? Right now, cannabis is still considered vice tech, which has a connotation. Are you seeing that the conversation around psychedelics is also influencing how people think about cannabis? Or how do you sort of think about how cannabis is seen in culture and how that might change the sort of business of investing or building cannabis companies?
Yeah, I think it's improving every day, and I can just tell you that from my own experience of speaking to investors all the time, right? Earlier in our, maturation, there was a whole host of folks who wouldn't even pick up the phone, and it was a non-starter. Now, there is real interest from your more traditional institutions to learn. Are they ready to commit and deploy dollars into the space? Maybe a little early for that, but now they need to know and understand it because it's becoming more and more important. So, I'm talking about the largest mutual funds, universities, endowments, pensions, et cetera, you name it. That has all been sort of inbound led, and there's a real interest in understanding more about our space. So I think it continues to get better. And honestly, if there wasn't that early stigma or even some lingering, there wouldn't be opportunities for people like me, right? The whole reason we can be in here and be, trailblazers to some degree is because other people didn't want to. So I'm thankful for it. And I'm glad we've been, hopefully been part of affecting some of that change and getting to people to look at cannabis as a very legitimate, real industry where they should be spending time and deploying dollars.
Where did that early stigma come from, you think? What's the source of that stigma?
Oh, God, it has been imprinted in our brain for 100 years. It kind of dates back to this, propaganda from the U.S. government for something called reefer madness. You can go on YouTube and look it up. It is the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen, and people, smoking and then running around and trying to kill people. I mean, it was just literally pure propaganda. Then, as we had this kind of war on drugs, it was a very tactical way, and this is like recorded, from the recordings from Watergate with Nixon, talking about how targeting, making cannabis even more restrictive would allow them to go after sort of opponents of the administration, right? Which largely was minorities, people of color, hippies, whatever. And then even in the media, there's been this huge stigma of what it means to be a cannabis consumer, right? And, I love a lot of these artists and folks who are big consumers, from, the Dead to Marley to Snoop even, right, who's one of my partners. But they also just represent one side of the coin, right? One type of consumer. But for so long, that's the only vision we had of what that meant. The reality is obviously very, very different. And, cannabis consumers literally come in every shape, size, creed, color, et cetera. And so I think, 100 years of that kind of, treatment is difficult to overcome. But I think we've made tremendous strides, even in the last decade. And people really start, looking at cannabis as what it is, which is, a medicine, a recreational alternative, a health and wellness product. I mean, with hemp, even a, sustainable, resource that can be used for, building and clothing. I mean, it is an incredible plant. And I think there's going to be very few people in the world who don't have some exposure to cannabis in some format in their daily lives. And so I think, we're not far away from that. And that curve is very exponential. And I think you'll see more and more of it to come.
Totally. That's exciting. What do we think or what are some of the big debates, internal debates within the space, right now in terms of, some camps believing X and other camps believing Y? Like, what are the sort of, when you talk to other people in the industry, like what are the big sort of questions or disagreements on?
Yeah. So, I mentioned to you that like, we don't really get involved or focus on too much of like the hard asset side of the business, cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, retail. I mean, it's incredibly critical. It's very important. Our view is that long-term, it becomes a little more commodified. It takes a ton of capital to like really be leaders there. So for us, it doesn't necessarily make sense. So I wouldn't say that's like some big cultural divide where, we sit on one side of the fence and people on the other. We are very close to all the largest, multi-state operators and Canadian licensed producers. They're very, very critical. It's just not where we concentrate. And I think if we also included that into our investment universe, it would be stretched pretty thin because there's so many of those companies too. So, but that's one of the places where, people have different areas that they want to invest in. And what's so interesting about cannabis is that it kind of has something for everyone, even from an investor standpoint, right? I mentioned to you Bespoke Financial, right? And the way they operate is they have a debt vehicle in which folks can invest in, and it provides a very attractive yield to investors in that vehicle. That's very much more of a yield junkie family office kind of a product, and people love it, and there's lots of interest in it. And then, similarly, you have things more on the sort of venture side. There's a lot of people who are doing sale leasebacks on the real estate front, and there are, REITs specifically for cannabis. So there is, no shortage of financial products of how people can invest in cannabis. And I think different groups have different areas of focus and where they want to put their attention. So, again, I wouldn't know if that completely answers your question about like some great divide, but that's certainly, some difference in opinion and where people want to sort of spend their time.
And was that always the philosophy of your firm, or did that evolve over time? And if so, what inspired it?
I'd say it was, I wouldn't say it was always the philosophy, but as we built the firm and really set out for our first major fundraise, we had settled there. So when I was doing my early research on the space, I looked at everything. I looked at the public companies, looked at growers, talked to manufacturers, talked to brands. And I think the things that influenced us most, and it's two parts, right? Is one, when we thought about this idea of scalability, we just saw that to be the most prevalent in the ancillary spaces. So we just thought these were much more scalable businesses. So that's the one reason that attracted us there. And then, absolutely, when we spoke to a lot of investors, it was a lot more palatable, in the folks that we were speaking to. They felt some degree of protection of, dealing with businesses that had to be licensed by the government, weren't, again, quote unquote, touching the plant. So I think for us, we landed there through a process and discovery and whatnot. And now, like I said, we've expanded that universe more, and we're more comfortable with things that are closer to the plant, like consumer brands and things like that. But yeah, it's been a process, and I think it'll continue to be a process and continue to be iterative as we get deeper and deeper into the industry. And I think there will be times when that'll be opportunistic. Here's this moment when there's a lot of distress, or there's, interesting late stage opportunities, or there's, something more on the debt side. And, as experts in this one particular industry, I hope we can be flexible and have future vehicles that can target different parts of the ecosystem.
Totally. How should we think about global and geographical sort of differences within cannabis, and how do you think about that as a firm?
Yeah, no, great question. And it's very, very interesting of how the global story is playing out. So with North America as a focus, Canada fully legal, US completely fragmented, right? Then you go to South America and it's disparate. Different countries are looking to be potential really interesting providers of input or biomass, right? Like think about how much cheaper you can produce cannabis in parts of South America. So that's really interesting. In Europe, so far, there's been a very heavy focus on medical. So, Germany is the largest kind of importer of cannabis from a medical perspective. It's distributed through their pharmacy networks. And everyone is taking a little bit of a different crack at it. And I think really what they're doing is focusing a lot of their attention on, North America and the US in particular, and how, various stages of legalization have worked and what makes sense. So, we're kind of like a testing ground for the rest of the world as they think about what it's going to look like for their economies. And, I use the word economy very specifically, because that's at the end of the day what drives a lot of the decisions around legalization. Think about where we're sitting today, with COVID, tax coffers for governments have been hit massively. And how do you start making up for some of that loss? And I think that's where sort of cannabis comes in also as a really exciting, revenue stream for these governments and job creation and again, there's a massive social justice element to it as well. Thinking about all the, largely minorities who've been locked up for, tiny possession charges and are serving, years, sometimes decades for something that now in many parts of the world is fully legal. So, but again, I think, eventually it will be at the same scale that we're looking at in Canada. It'll come in waves. And I think, more conservative parts of the world, like Asia, will be late to the game. But once, we've seen that progression in the US and in Europe, just like any other industry, whether you see, telecom or mobile or anything else, the rest of the world will catch up.
Totally. And just going back to the enterprise side of things, is it, or even the fintech side of things, is it as simple as take sort of SaaS for other verticals or fintech and see what's worked there, and then just sort of cross apply it to the cannabis industry, because everything that works in other businesses will likely work here? Or how do you sort of think about the similarities between cannabis and other verticals and corresponding?
I think you start there. Yeah. It's always a good place to start. And then you have to adjust for all the nuances and complexity of cannabis, right? Think about it from any perspective, right? Like you and I sat here today and we came up with a great sort of skincare brand. There are kind of co-packers who can develop it for us. There's people we can talk to for formulation. There's national, international distributors. We can do a bunch of things on e-commerce. Makes sense. Now you come in and you say, hey, let's do that same thing, but it should have THC because it can also relax you at the same time. It can be really interesting. Now you just added so many layers of complexity to your business, right? Like we can't do it as easy as we could maybe in the non-THC iteration, right? Because it's state by state, different manufacturers in each place. A bunch of people will refuse to work with us. How are we going to bank the business? How many distributors we'll use? What kind of redundancies are we going to build in? It gets complex. So that's just one example, and that kind of sits on top of everything else, right? the same issues you would have with any other technology or whatever. Cannabis is nuanced and complex. But I think what we've been seeing outside of cannabis is that most industries are complex and nuanced. Cannabis is just kind of like 10x that because of the regulatory challenges. So I think all of that is super intriguing for us because it just means more complex, interesting issues to solve. And I think that's why we'll see a lot of really interesting companies come out of here, and then eventually, really complex technologies that we've built can be applied from cannabis to other industries because they haven't had to think about it in that way, and we have. So I think it's going to come kind of full circle in that way. But what you're talking about is always a good place to start. I mean, that's how most things kind of start.
Totally. Speaking of other complex industries, pharma is a good example, and Viva is a company that was like Salesforce for the pharma industry, and I think was a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. We made a bet on a company called Distru that maybe be hopefully hopefully something similar. But these just vertical SaaS plays are big opportunities because these industries are just so complex and nuanced and custom.
No, absolutely. And I think entrepreneurs in the cannabis industry need to get a lot more credit for what they do. And I think some people think they're going after a shallower pool where they can come in and dominate, and it's just not that easy. And if you've invested into the space, I think I'm sure you've experienced that already. With kind of complexities that come with the space. Totally.
I think that's a great place to wrap. Karan, this has been a fantastic episode. For people who want to learn more and learn more about Casa Verde and potentially get in touch with it, with you guys, where could you point them?
Yeah, CasaVerdeCapital.com. Can learn more about us, and there's a space there to get in touch. And then, we're on socials on LinkedIn and Instagram. It's Casa Verde Cap. We're very responsive. We look at everything. So anyone who gets in touch will likely hear back from us quite quickly.
Yeah. Karan, this has been a great episode.
Awesome, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.